Well, why don't we move on to this concept of relationships? And, maybe you can talk about that aspect of things. Obviously people can't compromise. They can compromise without relationships, but it's certainly probably easier if you have a relationship with someone else to get to a compromise. So what is your interest in that area, and what have you seen?
Yeah, so this connects to my broader interest in just trying to understand who has the power and who has the influence and who has what it takes to try to actually get things done in Washington and who doesn't. And so Jason Roberts and I, and Jason's a political science professor at the University of North Carolina, have really just in the last year started digging into this question to try to understand to what degree do the nature or the quality or the maybe the positive versus negative nature of relationships, both personal and professional, among the people who work on Capitol Hill affect their abilities, again, either positively or negatively, to negotiate with each other, to work with each other, to find agreements and pass things that require compromise, which most things do. And what we found so far, it's been a lot of interviewing. We've also been collecting some data on congressional travel, so who travels together and whether members who travel together are more likely to collaborate in the legislative process. That data side of things is still ongoing, but preliminarily it looks like it does help. But what we found sort of conceptually and from the interviews is that, you know, the lack of relationships or maybe like the negative nature of some relationships on Capitol Hill today isn't really the problem. Party conflict's the problem. The gap between the parties is the problem. Like how much they disagree on the issues and all the political incentives for them to disagree is the problem. But relationships can be a solution to that problem. That if you can get people to start to trust each other on Capitol Hill, if you can get a Democrat and Republican who have the clout to work together and do something, if they trust each other enough to negotiate with each other, to go and talk to people on their side of the aisle honestly and come back to them and be honest about what they've heard, to not stab each other in the back as they work through the legislative process, they can hold together and they can find places of compromise and they can see it through. But without that trust, it's hard to overcome all the other things that really make it hard to get things done on Capitol Hill and all the other reasons, especially for Democrats and Republicans, to not work together. So it seems like these relationships, building good, trusting relationships among members of Congress can be something that can help us and can help them get over the hill on some of these really vexing political issues that really, really divide the party and really divide the voters of both parties.
See, I wonder whether this concept of relationships, it greases the wheels of compromise, right, to a certain
Mhm.
extent. Um, but you might say the same thing about business from, when there was very weak law, right? In that case, you don't have good laws to enforce your contract. So you have to rely on relationships to get things done. And maybe Congress is something of the same thing, since you don't have a very clear, you can't trade easily in Congress, right? You can't trade my interest and your interest, and we have a market, right, where it
Right.
would all be transactional and relationships weren't needed. But since you don't have that structure, relationships are crucial in order to bundle
Yeah.
things together and to pass bills.
That's right. And especially on some issues, unlike spending bills, there is literally an easy compromise you can come to. Whereas if you want to do $10 on this and I want to do 20, we'll do 15. You can't split the difference in other things. You can't split the difference on like abortion. You can't split the difference on moral issues, especially. The most things you cannot split the difference. It's either one thing or another. And so like that's where you really need something else to help you. And it can't just necessarily be transactional. And more than anything, it's building like what the people we've interviewed over and over again told us is that working with someone on legislation, compromising with them day to day, trying to figure out what you can do requires a level of trust. And these are not necessarily novel, like social science findings. These are, we're drawing on literature from organizational psychology as background for this, where they find that like this is what's true in any work environment, in any professional environment. People work better together if they trust each other and if they can get along. And they don't work as well together if they are leery of each other, if they don't like somebody. Like that disrupts any kind of professional workplace. And Congress is a professional workplace just like anywhere else. Has its own, unique quirks that make it different in other ways, but it's still a workplace where people need to try to find a way to work together.
Yeah, well, I think one of the big differences between Congress and a company, maybe with the exception of Bridgewater, is this concept of transparency, right? Um, so, can you build relationships with people if you have cameras on you during every meeting? And that's a question I've wondered. You know, my background's really a lot in exploiting transparency to create products, right? And I like transparency, and as
Yeah.
someone who's a voter and a citizen, I want transparency. But on the other side, there's a dark side to transparency, which is people can't compromise. Power will move away from those transparent processes, maybe to non-transparent processes. So I'm curious about your work in this area and what conclusions you've come to.
Yeah, I mean, my conclusions don't line up with what you just said, that transparency is wonderful and we need transparency in government. And it's not as if any of us would want a government where you had no idea what it was doing at any point in time. But at the same time, it does make compromise harder, because when you're trying, you can't deliberate, can't compromise, you can't do these things in front of an audience, especially an audience where voters on each side of the aisle are so divided themselves, because compromise requires giving up on something that you and your supporters really want. And there's a tendency there where if you give up on something, you're going to get called out on Twitter as a sellout or a shill or something worse, usually something worse. And members of Congress don't want that. And so negotiating in front of the cameras just means everyone's going to stick to their hard lines, because that's what wins you accolades in the media. That's what wins you accolades on social media. But if you can get people away from the cameras and they want to accomplish something, like if there's agreement at the very least that we should do something here, like there's a need to take action in this space, and we agree on that much. Now we can sit down and figure out what can we all agree to, or at least what can we all not be opposed to put together. And there's so many ways you can do that. It can literally mean like, well, I'm willing to compromise on my heart, like, well, my strong beliefs on this part if you compromise on that part, or you care really a lot about having this piece in the bill and I care a lot about having this piece in the bill, and neither of us really cares about the other one, so let's put them together. Like, there's a lot of ways you can do it, but that's hard to do in the open. That's hard to do in front of cameras, because the audience is going to react, and the audience is not necessarily going to be as sensitive to the need to compromise as you, the legislator, are.
Right, because you want to get things done.
Right. And that's your job. You were sent to Washington to do things. There's pressure to do them, especially when you're in the majority, because now the onus of governance is on you. And so, and everybody in Washington knows that compromise is necessary 99% of the time, that the number of things in which you don't have to make compromises and you don't have to enter into negotiations to get done are very small. It's a very few set of things. So you know from the start, like, this is what I want to accomplish, but I'm not going to get what I want. And in fact, I need to get people from the other side of the aisle to go along with this. And so where can we get to that makes me still happy enough with the progress we're making, but makes these other folks willing to sign on and willing to support it? And that means, like, making some of your more hardline voters less than satisfied, because it's not going to be exactly what you want. It's not going to be $2,000 checks. It's going to be $1,400 checks. It's not going to be getting the minimum wage bill in the budget reconciliation package. It's going to be taking it out so you can get all the other things. And of course, hardliners don't like that, but it's reality. But it's easier to come to those agreements without the bright lights, without the cameras watching you do it, because it obscures who was the one who actually capitulated on each side. You weren't in the voters weren't in the room to see who capitulated and who didn't, and why, and what the negotiations were about. On camera, you would get to see exactly who was like, you know what, we should give up on the minimum wage, and that person's gonna get slammed. And so just no one does it. And so you need that space. They need that space to actually talk with each other open and honestly in order to get things done.
So, in your experience or in your work, where should transparency exist and where should privacy exist? Is it, obviously the leadership right now is the private arena, but what about committees? What about, debates? Where do you see privacy being important versus transparency?
So to me, you want to maximize transparency is spaces where Congress is having debates. That's where they're talking about the issues. They're expressing their different viewpoints. They're telling each other, and they're representing their different groups and their constituencies on, here's what we think is right, here's what we think is wrong. That's the public facing component of Congress. And that's where you need all the transparency in the world, and where you want as much transparency and you want as much broadcasting of that as possible, because part of Congress's job is to represent the public and communicate and reflect and project those debates that exist in society, so we can see that we as a society are having these conversations. But deliberations are the opposite. Deliberations are internal. Deliberations are about figuring out what can be done and figuring out where compromises can be made. And that's where you need to sometimes turn the transparency down at least a little bit. You need to give members of Congress quiet places, private places, away from the cameras, where they can try to work out what can be agreed to. Now, of course, once those agreements are made, they all need to vote on it and indicate whether they support it or oppose it in as transparent a way as possible. That's why we have roll call votes, because then you can see at the end of the day, you put together this legislative package, you've put the entire text of the law or of the proposal is available to the entire American public, and in fact to the entire world, which is wonderful. And you can see whether people voted to support it or oppose it, and they can explain why they did or they didn't through their own communications, through social media, through press releases, through whatever they want. So you bring the transparency back in once you have a proposal for people to decide, am I for it or am I against it? But I don't think you really want as much transparency as possible when those deliberations are ongoing, because I think the consequence is just that you're not going to get any outcomes, and that's not good either. But but you also wouldn't want to shut off all the lights. You still want to see the debates playing out. You still want people to go on the record with what they oppose, what they support, and what they oppose, because then voters have information to take into account in the next election.
So we've jumped the gun a little bit on one of my later questions, but we'll pursue it here anyway. So this concept of debate versus deliberation, I think it's very useful. So debate, where we're really airing everybody's side of the issue. Should it happen in committee? Should it happen on the floor? Should it happen in some other way? The Monday morning, or the where everyone can say whatever they want for 60 seconds in the morning. What's the right forum for that? And what's the right place for deliberations? Is it in the committees? Is it in leadership? Have you thought about where the locations of these things should be?
Yeah, I mean, that's really tough. I think the floor ultimately is for Congress. I think the floor ends up having to be and probably should be the place of debate, as well as forums outside of Congress, whether it's on television or what have you. But I think the House and the Senate floors can be really nice places for that, because there's rules of decorum on the House and the Senate floor. They can't just yell at each other and attack each other with ad hominem attacks, and those don't have really any value whatsoever. But you're allowed to have these really sharply pointed debates about who supports what and why you support this and why you oppose what they want to do, that you can have in those venues while keeping it civil. And so I think the House and Senate floors are the wonderful places for debate. And as you know, the House and the Senate floor are constantly televised. You can stream them on the internet. And so it's an easy way for the public to see Congress debating the issues that are important to everyone. I think committees could be places where you turn more towards the deliberation, but then you need to give committees some opportunities to turn the cameras off. The transparency reforms of the 1970s were wonderful, but it's not in coincidence that once they turned the cameras on everywhere, actual decision making went behind the scenes. Because when you're being watched, you're not as frank and honest about what you're willing to give up and what you're going to push for, and you're not these negotiating conversations that used to happen, I think, in literal committee meetings when they knew they weren't being watched all the time, happened right in those rooms. That would still be great. And it still does happen. It just happens in the ante rooms, usually among smaller groups of members, which probably isn't ideal. And so I think committees still could and should be the place where these deliberations occur, because those are the members that are engaged in these issues, who know things about these issues, have access to staff who are experts in these issues. But it's never going to work that way if the cameras are on all the time.
So, in fact, you mentioned the staff there, and I'd like to hear your opinion on how the staff interact with this process, right? Because a lot of the deliberations could be happening through staff members rather than the members themselves. So how does that work, since you've been in the trenches with that?
They are, because no one member can do everything that they're supposed to do at the same time, which is why you have staff. The staff collect information. They are in contact with other member offices. If you're a staffer for a House member, you usually have some portfolio of issues that you work on, and your boss sets the priorities. Oh, I want to do something in this space. And then you have meetings with the boss about exactly what they want to accomplish, and you game out, well, who are some partners we could reach out to on our side and on the other side to get it done? And then it's the staffer who has to take the lead and sort of like doing the day-to-day work of connecting with staffers in the other offices, sharing with them what you want to accomplish, maybe sharing bill drafts, getting their feedback, figuring out what their member needs to be in support of this thing you want to introduce, this idea you want to push forward. And then you need to go and you need to talk to the committee chair or the committee chair's staff and try to see, like, is this something that we could get as part of the committee's agenda for the coming year or not? And what do we need to do to make that work? And a lot of that stuff is done through staff because the member is just one person who's asked to do more than one person's job. But those people work at the behest of the member. They're constantly back in contact with the member. The member is like the CEO of the representative office, and they have these staff who are there to sort of execute the different parts of the game plan. And then the member asserts his or herself as absolutely necessary to get things done on a one-to-one level with their colleagues.
Great. Well, we're going to move on now to our standard set of questions we ask everyone who comes on the program. So I'll move on to my next question if you're ready.
I'm ready.
All right. So my question is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
So what do I think representation should mean? So I think this is a really good question. And for me, representation, I think, needs to balance two things. It needs to balance both the position taking of members of Congress on the issues, but also the policymaking efforts of members of Congress on the issues. I think often when we talk about representation, or I think it always strikes me when most people think and talk about representation, they're really thinking about the second half of that. They're thinking about representation as Congress and members of Congress delivering the goods, passing policies that are supported by citizens or by certain groups of citizens, passing legislation that provides benefits to citizens or specific groups of citizens. But I think that is a big part of representation, but I think representation is also about expressing and reflecting the voices, concerns, opinions of the many different peoples of the United States. That is, representation is also about members of Congress taking sharp positions on the issues, communicating those issues, speaking for the people they represent during political debates. I think in some ways we have less appreciation for that part of representation. Sometimes we complain that lawmakers talk too much, or that there's a lot of hot air in the Capitol because they're all just talk. But talking is important. And a legislature is not just a policymaking institution. It's also a forum for debate and for debate and for taking positions on the issues and reflecting the conflict in society. It's also a place, as John Stuart Mill put it, where every interest and shade of opinion in the country can have its cause passionately pleaded. And so I think real representation for a country in a kind of democratic system like ours with a national legislature requires both lawmakers who work to affect policy change on behalf of their constituents, but also work to project the voices of their constituents through debate and through messaging and through all the talk that we hear.
It's a very interesting distinction on this kind of voicing what are probably more like the beliefs of a district, and then the way that the representative might actually vote might be different. Right. Based on their own judgments is what I'm sort of hearing from you about the long-term interests potentially of their district.
Right. And you can't always even vote for exactly what your district wants, because you're presented with a bill and there are two options to vote for it or vote against it. And your constituents may actually want something else, like a third option or a different combination of things. But that's what the talking part is for. That's what the expression is for, that representatives can bring through taking positions on the issues and talking about what they support. They can give voice to those people, but then they have to turn to the business of what policies can we pass to make a difference in the lives of people, to make a difference in the lives of my constituents in my district or state, and then cast their votes on those things that are always going to be imperfect and not quite exactly what they had in mind. And I think we need a better recognition that there's a difference between what you would prefer to do if you were, king of the world, or queen of the world, and what you can do through a legislative process. And I think being a good representative requires being able to give voice to what you would do if you had all the power, but also being realistic about the fact that making policy requires compromising with the other 534 members of Congress and the Senate who also are trying to give voice to very different constituencies throughout the country.
Right. But I guess just I want to pin you down a little bit more tightly on this idea of the beliefs of the constituency versus what their interests might be in the long term, right? Because obviously, the district could have very set beliefs about something, or they might have no beliefs about something, or there may be beliefs about something of which the representative disagrees and has a different opinion.
Yeah.
So do you think of the representative as being as judging according to his own interpretation of the long-term interests of that district, or is he just recounting beliefs?
I mean, I think the nature of the job is such that they have to, when push comes to shove, use their own judgment about what they think is best. And I think they also have to, at the same time, balance what they think is best for their particular corner of the country against also what they think is best for the country as a whole. I think that's the duality that members of Congress constantly have to live with, which requires them even more so to use their judgment. Is they represent just their district, but they're making policy that affects the entire country. And so they have to constantly, at least some of the time, balance those two things, because sometimes what's best for your district may not be what's best for the country, and vice versa. And I don't think you can always just go one way or the other there. I think sometimes you do have to be that advocate for your district when you think what's happening would be really bad for it. But I think sometimes you need to also be willing to do what's right for the country, even if your district doesn't like it so much.
All right. Next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time?
I think this goes back to the last point, and that I think it really needs a constant balancing of its efforts between spending time making policy and spending time communicating lines of debate and disagreement. I mean, in some ways it already does both of these things, but I think like at different times in congressional history, you've had too much of one or too much of the other, right? You like maybe right now you might say that Congress does too much messaging, too much position taking, and not enough of the other. And probably at other times in history, it did not enough messaging and position taking, where people maybe didn't feel that they were here having their voices projected by the Congress. So I think you have to find sort of a balance there. And I don't know what the exact right balance is, but I think when Congress is doing its business, it needs to constantly be attentive to, we need to make sure there's time for just debate and expression, but we also need to make sure that we're spending enough time on deliberations and making public policy.
What about the allocation of time between legislating and oversight? Do you have a position on that?
So I tend to see those as like sort of like the two parts of policymaking, but how exactly to balance those two things is a good question. I mean, I think you should be trying to do as much within the policymaking realm. You should be trying to do as much of both as possible, which is really one of the best arguments for continuing to have a robust division of labor among committees and subcommittees. Because if you divide labor, you can always do more oversight. And I'm one of those people that thinks Congress does a better job of an oversight than most people think, because I just think so much of it happens in sort of like non-public facing ways, with staff interacting with the executive branch and requesting information and having these briefings that aren't really hearings, but like where you have these engagements between the Hill and between the executive branch. But you know, like that's really where I think like that's one of the best efforts that you need to, Congress should preserve and protect this this really fine-grained division of labor from its committees down to its subcommittees, because if they're all then focusing on overseeing the programs under their jurisdiction, you're going to have enough eyes on what the executive branch is doing, which is of course going to develop new policymaking ideas as you see things that aren't working right, which can then feed itself back into the policymaking process.
How about time in Washington versus home, and fundraising versus other things?
Yeah. That's where you get me to go the farthest in terms of saying things should change. And that I do always think, not that members of Congress shouldn't spend time in their districts. Obviously, they need to still be connected with their constituents. But I think, I think anyone would agree that in recent years, things have skewed a bit more towards, or a bit too much towards, time at home versus time in Washington. And obviously communications technologies have made that easier, because the member may be back in the district, but their staff is still in Washington and they can stay in constant contact. But if you talk to staff, if you talk to a lot of staff, they'll tell you it still helps to have the member there, because there are some disagreements that can only be worked out on a member-to-member level. And if they're just in their districts, they can't be face-to-face with their colleagues and figure things out. So I think, and there's so many proposals on this about how you can at least have like longer, more sustained work periods in Washington. And then on fundraising, one of the best proposals I've heard in years for congressional reform is to bar fundraising while Congress is in session. And not because it would change like how much funds they raise, or it wouldn't change the relationships that members have with donors, but it would at least let them focus on legislating when they're in Washington. Whereas now, as you know, like they have to do their legislative tasks, and then they also have to go run to a fundraiser, or they have to run across the street to the DNC or the RNC to make some donor phone calls. And if that was just not on the table, the member at least would be able to focus more of their attention on the stuff happening in the House and the Senate, on the legislative efforts, on the oversight efforts. They wouldn't be constantly pulled away to do these other things, at least while they're in Washington, and then let them fundraise all they want the rest of the time.
Right. Next question is the one we addressed slightly earlier, but this will give you a chance to dig into it directly, which is how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
I think it really is what I said before, and that I think you need to maximize transparency, maximize coverage of Congress when it's debating things, show them having these debates, show them taking positions on the issues. But then for deliberations, really give them space, give them more space than they have, where the cameras are off, to talk with each other and try to figure out where they can come to agreements. These days, the only time they can do that is literally when they get away from the Capitol. If they go on a Codel, if they go on a trip to a foreign country, or if they go on their retreats, but most of the retreats at least tend to be partisan. Committees could be a nice place where you naturally have a bipartisan group of members together who care about the same issues. That's why they're on those committees for the most part. And if you just turn the cameras off sometimes, you could get them to at least have a little bit more like really more substantial conversations with each other, be willing to really deliberate without having to worry about how it's going to look on Twitter.
All right, next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
So I'm one of those rare people that thinks Congress actually runs pretty well, but it is far from perfect, obviously. And I also tend to think most of the big problems in our politics are not so much about Congress, but about the broader political environment that Congress has to operate in. But that said, there's still things that I think Congress could and should do. I think some of the biggest ones relate to congressional staff. I think Congress could always use more staff and more expertise. It already has a lot. It's not as if Congress is starved for staff, even if individual members sometimes are. But this is the place that writes all of our laws. The more experts you can bring in, the better. And also the more experts you can keep on Capitol Hill, the better. Congress should pay its staff better. There are too many talented staffers who leave Capitol Hill because the pay ends up not being worth the long hours and the grueling conditions and the impact it has on their family life. If you can at least pay them better, you can't do anything about how hard the work is, but you can at least pay them better so that it's not so tempting after a while to go into the private sector and cash in and get twice as much or 3 times as much money for the same kind of work. It can also help keep those expert staff around and keep them part of essentially the brain of Congress to just treat them better. Congress has continued to improve how it treats its human resources, but it needs to keep doing so. The work that's being done by the House Committee on Modernization has already done a lot here, but you can always provide more resources for staff. You can always provide more training for staff. You can always provide better protections for staff and for their livelihoods and for how they're treated by their bosses. All these things would make Congress a better place to work, which would help it continue to recruit some of the best and the brightest Americans into its halls well into the 21st century, which is really what you need to develop the most innovative policy ideas and to have the best people who are the best at getting this stuff done and getting us the best public policies we need as a country.
Right. So the next one is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
So this will be kind of a weird answer, and if it's okay, I want to name 2 books that I think have affected how I think about congressional reform the most. One is a book called The Imprint of Congress by David Mayhew. And this book really digs into the lasting effects, or as he puts it, the imprint that Congress has had on the country. It's in many ways a response to people who complain that Congress is a failing institution or is worse than it's ever been, what Mayhew points out really well is that people have always said this about Congress, that it's always been this much maligned institution, but it's also always had really a big lasting change on Congress. It continues to do so. It's not always as bad as it looks. And so that one's important because it reminds me that even though Congress isn't perfect, it's probably not as bad as we think it is, which means that it probably doesn't always need sort of this broad, like, sweep everything out and start from scratch. Because to some degree, people have always thought that about Congress. And it strikes me that there's enough virtues about Congress for it to have lasted as long as it has, and to have the kind of imprint that Mayhew has, that we probably shouldn't throw it all out. But the second book is a book called Disjointed Pluralism by Eric Schickler. And this book documents how reforms actually happen on Capitol Hill. And it has two big takeaways that I think any people who are interested in reform need to be attentive to. The first is that successful reform, just like successful policymaking, tends to require the building of coalitions among different groups of lawmakers who want very different things out of reform, who are concerned about very different things, maybe their individual power or their reelection hopes or the power of the party or ideological outcomes or what have you. For instance, in the 1970s, Congress reformed a lot of its internal processes because it had, and it was able to do so because it was able to find things to change about the committee structure or about other internal processes that made a lot of different people who had a lot of different goals happy. But this means that reforms, just like policies, are also often awkward, compromised enactments. And so they carry their own limitations and internal contradictions that will have unintended consequences. And so what this reminds me is that we always need to be careful about reform, that the reforms that you enact will have consequences you didn't anticipate because they're never going to be as cleanly constructed as you might hope because you wouldn't be able to get them passed. And so when I put those two things together, it reminds me very realistic about reform. On one hand, like, Congress isn't all bad. There are good things about it, and we should try to preserve them. And then we should be extremely cautious about reform because you don't want to inadvertently make things worse.
Right. Last question is, what plans do you have for your research over the long term? What are you going to do next?
So the things I'll be working on probably in the foreseeable future is, one, this project I told you about. We're working on relationships in Congress and how those can affect negotiations and success in the legislative process. That's research that's really just getting started. I anticipate working on that for the next several years, like with Jason. I also have a lot of research that's really getting underway that's really about the role of minority parties. I did all that work with Francis about majority parties and majority party power. And one of the big takeaways I had from that research is that minority parties have a lot more power than people think. And so I've sort of started turning to trying to understand what gives minority parties more or less capacity to be involved in different policymaking efforts. Like when should we understand when the minority is able to get involved and how and why, and when can't we? And the last thing is I always have this interest, and I want to continue to understand the role that committees play in the modern Congress, because there's a lot of committees these days tend to get viewed as having lost power relative to their heyday. And that's probably true to some degree. But I think they have a lot of influence in ways that people don't appreciate, because I think a lot of actual policy development, even if it's managed and overseen by party leaders, still happens in committee rooms. It just happens more behind the scenes in committee rooms between a chair and a ranking member and their staff, where they're the ones who start figuring out what kind of policy proposals can we put together that could eventually get some sort of bipartisan compromise where we can make a difference in the world. And I think we see it less because more stuff has gone behind the scenes, but I think committees still play an important role. And I want to sort of flesh that out and help understand like where committees are still really integral to the process.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim, so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.